Something in those leaked files suggests Bigfoot was captured, contained, and then somehow escaped again. David Paulides has spent years tracking missing people. But what if some cases were never truly accidents at all, and instead part of something hidden, controlled, and quietly cleaned up before anyone could understand it? 5 separate case files were sent to him, each describing encounters that feel too consistent, too calculated, and far too aware to dismiss as coincidence. So what exactly was discovered? Who tried to hide it? And why are these stories still leaking now? Tonight, we open 5 files that may reveal what was never meant to be seen. Before his name became tied to missing hikers, impossible search zones, and families left with questions that never healed, Paulides had already built a reputation for digging through reports, comparing details, and following loose ends longer than most people had the patience to endure. That is why the file packet that reached him in Northern California mattered so much. It did not land in the hands of a ghost hunter, a late-night podcaster, or someone looking for internet attention. It reached a man whose entire credibility came from treating strange cases like paperwork first and mystery second. What arrived was a bundle of copied field summaries, internal routing notes, partial transcripts, and a short memo that looked painfully ordinary at first glance. Buried in the middle of that packet was the image now attached to this case. Several hair-covered figures, broad-shouldered and human-like in the worst possible way, appearing to push themselves up through a broken floor inside what looked like a neglected utility room or a hidden service annex. At first, the picture seemed too extreme to trust. But the longer Paulides reportedly sat with the material, the more one detail refused to go away. The room did not look staged. The lighting sat naturally on the walls and debris. The cracked floor seemed to fail, outward, not inward. The figures were not posed like movie monsters trying to scare a camera. They looked crowded, urgent, and strangely coordinated, as if they were not emerging at random but moving through a route they already knew. Then he reached the attached memo, and that is where the story turned dark. The writer did not describe the event as an intrusion, an attack, or an animal incident. The word used was breach. That single word changed the emotional weight of the entire file, because a breach suggests something had been contained before it got out. It suggests barriers, protocols, and prior knowledge. More than that, it suggests that somewhere above the level of local deputies and volunteer search crews, somebody may have known these creatures were real long before the public was ever allowed to wonder. Paulides had spent years documenting cases where people vanished near berry patches, creek forks, steep ridges, and stretches of timber that suddenly felt wrong, even on paper. He had heard too many stories involving silence in the forest, dogs refusing to continue, strange calls from the dark, and search teams drifting toward terrain that made no sense. What made this leak so disturbing was the possibility that those incidents were not separate at all. The forests may not have mattered only because something lived there. They may also have mattered because remote wilderness gives institutions the one thing they value most when something goes wrong: distance. Distance keeps witnesses scattered. Distance slows reporters down. Distance lets local officials see only their piece of an event, while larger players manage the rest behind closed doors. If even part of that bundle was real, then the horror was bigger than Bigfoot itself. The real nightmare was the possibility that powerful people had known for years, had failed to control what they were hiding, and had left working families, hikers, hunters, and rural communities to absorb the danger, without ever being told what was really out there. The second document in the packet opened with a name, a date, and a routine assignment in northern Idaho, the kind of case that happens every year and rarely reaches beyond a local headline. A volunteer search coordinator named Aaron Lusk had gone out to check trail cameras along a remote stretch of timberline, and by all accounts, it should have been a simple in-and-out job before sunset. Lusk was not inexperienced, and that detail matters more than anything else in this story. He had spent years in that terrain, knew how to read weather, understood animal behavior, and had walked enough miles in the backcountry to recognize the difference between discomfort and danger. His early log entries reflected that confidence, describing wind direction, animal sign, and minor equipment issues in a calm, methodical tone that never hinted at panic. Then, within a span of less than 30 minutes, the tone shifted in a way that made later reviewers uneasy. At first, it was small things that could have been dismissed if they had appeared alone. Bird activity stopped across the drainage almost instantly, leaving behind a silence that Lusk described as unnatural for that hour. A smell appeared that he compared to wet fur and decay, then faded without any clear source. When taken separately, each of those details could be explained away. When they appeared together, they started to form a pattern that did not belong to any known animal behavior. The most disturbing moment came from the partial video transcript included in the file, which described Lusk pausing mid-sentence while documenting a camera unit, slowly turning toward a tree line, and lowering his voice in a way that suggested he had seen something he could not immediately explain. He did not run, and he did not shout, which made the reaction more unsettling rather than less. Instead, he stepped backward, carefully, as if he understood that turning his back would be a mistake. Lusk never returned to the trailhead that evening, and by the next morning, search teams were already moving into the area. What they found first was not a body or a sign of struggle, but his pack, placed upright beside a narrow game trail with its contents undisturbed. That detail alone raised quiet alarm among experienced responders, because panic leaves chaos behind, while deliberate placement suggests awareness, either from the missing person or from something else interacting with the scene. When Lusk was finally located, the situation became even harder to explain. He was found miles away from his expected route, in terrain dense enough to slow even large animals, yet there were no clear signs of how he had moved through it so quickly. He was conscious, but disoriented, and according to the report included in the leak, he repeated the same statement multiple times when asked what had happened. He said that one of them stayed where he could see it, holding his attention, while another one moved somewhere he could not track. That sentence was never included in the official summary released to the public, and that omission becomes difficult to ignore when placed next to the rest of the material in the packet. 2 search volunteers later reported hearing something pacing them from a parallel ridge during the extraction, matching their speed step for step without ever closing distance, and neither of those statements appeared in the final report either. When you place this case next to the earlier image and the language found in the internal notes, a darker possibility begins to form. If these creatures were real, and if they were capable of coordinated movement, distraction, and controlled proximity, then incidents like this were not random encounters. They were interactions managed on the creature's terms, in terrain that already favored them, and possibly within a system that someone else had been trying and failing to keep contained. By the time Paulides reached the 3rd file in the leaked bundle, the story stopped feeling like a collection of strange events and began to feel like something with a method behind it. This case came from a volunteer search effort near the Oregon-Washington border. where dozens of ordinary people had gathered to find a missing child, expecting a difficult day in rough terrain rather than an experience that would follow them for years. The conditions were exactly what you would expect in that part of the forest, with thick brush, uneven ground, and visibility that dropped sharply once you moved away from open paths. Teams stayed close together, calling out names, using whistles, and repeating simple phrases so nobody would drift too far from the group. It was structured, controlled, and familiar to everyone involved, which is why what happened next felt so deeply wrong. One of the volunteers later described the moment as if the forest had taken a breath and decided not to let it go. The usual background noise did not fade gradually the way it does at dusk or in shifting weather. Then the first voice came, and that was when everything began to break. A man heard his name spoken clearly from somewhere uphill, and because the tone sounded familiar, he responded without hesitation, assuming another team member had spotted something. The call came again within seconds, repeating his name in the same rhythm, yet now it came from a different direction, slightly farther away, as if whoever was calling had moved impossibly fast or had never been where the first voice seemed to originate. The team leader reacted immediately, telling everyone to stop answering, and although he could not explain his reasoning at that exact moment, something in the sound had triggered a warning that cut through training and logic. The voices sounded human, but not in the way real human voices behave. There was a strange precision in how the names were repeated, like an echo that understood language but not meaning, like something that had learned how to imitate without ever truly speaking. A handheld recorder carried by one of the volunteers captured fragments of what followed, and while much of it sounded ordinary at first, the details became harder to ignore the longer you listened. Footsteps, breathing, branches shifting, all of it layered over something else that did not belong. At two separate points, voices emerged from locations that could not be reached in the time between calls, repeating names with just enough familiarity to pull attention, but just enough distortion to make the listener hesitate. One volunteer later admitted, off record, that he felt something behind him more than once. When he turned, there was never anything there, yet the feeling did not go away, and it stayed with him long after the search ended. When Paulides compared this account to the internal notes from the earlier files, a connection began to form that was difficult to ignore. These were not the words of frightened volunteers trying to explain something they did not understand. They sounded like terms used by people who had studied the phenomenon long enough to recognize patterns and were now trying to describe it without saying too much. At that point, the question was no longer whether something existed in the forest. The question became far more unsettling because it suggested that whatever was out there might not only be watching human behavior, but quietly learning how to influence it in ways that most people would never recognize until it was too late. By the time Paulides reached the fourth set of documents, the story took a turn that felt quieter on the surface but far more unsettling underneath. There were no missing persons in this file, no panicked radio calls, and no chaotic search scenes. Instead, it followed a controlled test, a planned operation, and a man who had spent his entire career trusting data more than instinct. His name was Glenn Mercer, a retired fire behavior analyst who had been brought in to test a new thermal drone system in Northern California. The goal was simple and practical, at least on paper. The system needed to prove it could detect human heat signatures under dense forest canopy, something that could later be used to find lost hikers during emergencies. Mercer was the kind of man who believed in numbers, measurements, and repeatable results. not stories about creatures in the woods. The first flights went exactly as expected, which is why no one in the team felt any concern. The drone picked up deer moving through brush, a bear crossing near a creek, and scattered heat left behind on rocks that had absorbed sunlight during the day. Everything matched the models. Everything made sense, and that sense of control stayed intact right up until the third pass, just after the sun had dropped below the ridge. That was when the screen showed something that did not belong. At first, it appeared as a vertical heat shape standing in a narrow corridor of fallen trees. One of the operators assumed it was a trunk holding residual warmth, which is not unusual in certain conditions. But then the shape shifted, not randomly, not with the irregular movement of wind or heat distortion, but with weight. It leaned slightly, as if redistributing balance, and what had looked like a static object suddenly became something else entirely. Mercer did not react dramatically. He leaned closer to the monitor, asked for a second pass, and adjusted the drone's position for a clearer angle. The figure did not disappear when approached, and that detail stayed with everyone who reviewed the footage later. It moved, but only enough to stay partially hidden behind trees, never fully exposing itself, yet never fully retreating either. Then something happened that no one in that control trailer could explain in a way that felt comfortable. The figure stepped slowly into a narrow gap between two trees, a position where its upper body became fully visible in the thermal view. It did not rush, and it did not panic. It seemed to choose that spot, holding still for a few seconds, as if it understood exactly how much of itself the camera could capture. The proportions were wrong in a way that no one could easily dismiss. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long, the shape too balanced for a bear and too large for any human. And then, just as calmly, it lowered itself out of view. Not like an animal dropping to all fours, not like a person crouching quickly, but like something folding downward with deliberate control, disappearing from the thermal feed as if it had stepped out of sight rather than fled. When the ground team entered the area the next morning, the forest offered no clear answers. There was no camp, no equipment, no signs of human presence. What they did find were impressions in soft soil, deep and spaced far apart, suggesting something. Heavy had moved through the area on two legs. One of the prints showed a detail that Mercer later struggled to describe without sounding uncertain. The middle of the footprint had flexed in a way that did not match any boot or bare human foot, as if it had been built to carry weight differently. But what stayed with him was not the print. It was the behavior. In his own words, recorded in a follow-up interview that never made it into any public report, Mercer said something that quietly unsettled everyone who heard it. He said it did not feel like they had discovered something. It felt like something had allowed them to see it. And when you place that idea next to everything in the earlier files, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Because if something out there understands when it is being observed, and can control how much of itself is revealed, then the real danger may not be what it looks like. The real danger may be how much it already knows about us. The fifth file did not come from a search team or a controlled test, and that is what made it feel closer to home than anything before it. It followed a geologist named Hannah Voss, a woman trained to trust ground stability, slope movement, and measurable risk, not stories about things hiding in the dark. She had been sent into a remote basin in British Columbia to assess landslide potential after late-season erosion. The job was routine, the kind of work that keeps roads open and prevents accidents long before they happen. A helicopter dropped her in with basic equipment and a satellite communicator, expecting to pull her out the next day. But the weather shifted, and she had to stay one more night. At first, nothing felt wrong. She set up a small camp near a line of old cedar trees, logged her notes, and moved through the area with the calm focus of someone who had done this many times before. The forest was quiet, but not unusually so, and the only sounds came from water moving somewhere below, the slope. Then, sometime after midnight, the first sound reached her. It was not loud, and it did not come from far away. It sounded like two small stones being tapped together once, then silence, then again from a slightly different position. At first, she dismissed it as natural movement, something shifting in the dark, something she did not need to worry about. But the pattern did not go away. The sound repeated at uneven intervals, never close enough to locate, never far enough to ignore. Each time she turned her headlamp, the forest beyond the light seemed to pull back, as if whatever was out there understood exactly where her vision ended. That was when the feeling began. Not fear in the usual sense, but a growing awareness that she was no longer alone in a passive environment. Something was there, not moving randomly, not making noise without purpose, but staying just outside her ability to confirm it. She later described it in a way that stayed with Paulides longer than any footprint or photograph. She said it felt like she was being studied. At one point, she moved her campfire slightly, trying to widen the area she could see. Within minutes, the stone sound shifted position, now coming from a different angle, as if adjusting to her change. It did not approach, and it did not retreat. It remained, holding distance, holding silence, and waiting. That word appears again in her recorded statement. Waiting. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she packed her gear before dawn and moved into an open gravel clearing, choosing visibility over comfort, choosing exposure over the feeling of being surrounded. When the helicopter returned, they did not find a frightened camper. They found someone who had made a decision. She never returned to fieldwork after that, and when asked what she believed had been out there, she did not describe a creature in detail. She described behavior. She said whatever was in that forest understood fear, and it used it carefully, as if it knew exactly how far it could push before a human mind begins to break. When Paulides stepped back from the files and looked at everything as a whole, the story stopped being about one sighting, one missing person, or one strange night in the forest. It began to look like a pattern that someone had worked very hard to keep separated, buried inside reports that never fully spoke to each other. Across different states, different years, and completely unrelated cases, the same elements kept appearing. Silence that arrived too suddenly, movement that stayed just out of sight, voices that felt familiar but slightly wrong, people being guided, not chased, into places where rescue became difficult. And then there was the language, not in public reports, but in those internal notes that were never meant to be read outside a closed system. Words like containment, exposure, behavioral response, and re-entry kept showing up in ways that did not match accidents or wildlife encounters. They sounded like pieces of a larger conversation, one that ordinary people were never included in. That is where the real unease begins. Because if something out there has been known, studied, and quietly managed at levels far above local authorities, then the biggest risk was never the creature itself. The risk was the silence around it, the decisions made behind closed doors, and the possibility that everyday people were left unprotected simply because acknowledging the truth would be too costly. And once you see that pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it. Because the next time someone disappears in the woods, the question may not be what happened to them. The question may be who already knows.